question. Is it part 2 stand part Jacinda Ardern?
Mr Chair. Thank you, Mr Chair. I assume with part 2 we're now moving into some of the more substantive schedules that are set out under, I'm assuming we're able to take those as the those provisions as well in this debate, Mr Chair. Yes. Obviously in part 2 we're repealing the Fencing of Swimming Pools Act, but during the committee stages, I do want to just point out that there was a view that the standard that was set under the FOSPA would be lost, but we were advised that the acceptable solution under the Building Act was the one specified in the schedule of FOSPA, that all of the work that had done previously on consultation around standards would not be lost. Now, if I've got that wrong, I would certainly ask the Minister to correct the record, because I know that was a legitimate concern that has been raised in this debate. Mr Chair, though, I want to speak a little bit to an area which has only been briefly touched on by some of my colleagues, and that is the way that we are now, as a result of this bill, going to be treating spa pools and hot tubs. So under this legislation, we've got 3 different definitions, if I've got this right. We will have heated small heated pools. Previously we had separately spa pools, hot tubs. We'll have small heated pools. We will have residential pools, and we will have pools generally. Hopefully that is intended to try and reduce down some of the confusion, especially for small heated pools. Point I wanted to make, though, Mr Chair, is that the definition and some of the ways that small heated pools, as set out in the schedule, will be treated is uncharted territory. Really, before we've had regulations relating to this that hasn't been properly enforced. And so now what we're saying is that essentially that a standard will apply to small heated pools where the top surface of every wall of the pool is at all points not less than 760 mil above the adjacent floor on the ground to inhibit climbing. And that for those other pools we're able to access more easily, that they must be covered with a lockable lid. Now, there was real debate and discussion about whether or not that in and of itself was going to be sufficient. The concern was that is fine when it's in use and when there isn't any deterioration of those locks and so on. When they are not in use, then obviously you don't have a protection mechanism, because we're now saying that a elevated hot tub with a lockable lid won't have to have any other form of physical barrier around it. Now, the concern there is that, as was pointed out by submitters, that the point of distraction could be that with spa pools as well, and those kinds of pools that are hot, people often do leave them for periods of time. They might go and get a drink of water, they might go to use the bathroom. There are often times where these pools go unsupervised. Now, as a committee, the committee was trying to reach a point of reason where you had enough protections in place, but that, for instance, there was acknowledgement that often these pools are raised above the ground as well, and so maybe that does put them in a slightly different category. That is not to say that there aren't concerns with this provision. In particular, we heard that there have been drownings where children have accessed underneath covers, or where they have accessed a pool when a lockable lid hasn't been in place. So I think what I wanted to point out at this point is that this was a real source of contention for us. It was not an easy decision, and that I think it deserves monitoring. Now, these provisions, and again, a bit of debate about this, aren't going to be monitored by local councils. The MB takes responsibility for these provisions, if I've got that right. I think it's incumbent on us as a House to reflect back on whether or not, after a year, let's look at what's happening with them. Let's check that we've got this right, because this is, in my mind, a line call, this provision. Now, what is not a line call for us, and we've said this all the way through, Mr Chair, I think now we're at the point of the bill where I can expand on this slightly. We are absolutely not supporting this bill if the current schedule remains as it stands, where we allow one side of a pool to be accessed by a door that doesn't necessarily latch automatically, that could be accessible by a child, but just has an alarm on it. That is not acceptable. in our minds, that provision opens up a false assumption, a false sense of security for families that because they're compliant with the law, they have created a safe space, Mr. Chair. That because they have complied with the law, that surely there's some research and evidence that suggested audible alarms stop kids from drowning. There is no such evidence. We don't know that. We know some companies now are producing these alarms. We don't know that they are an acceptable solution where you do not have an automatically latching door or a door that is accessible. So that is not acceptable to us. And let me just cover again what it says. It says under the schedule, where a building forms all or part of an immediate pool area, doors between the building and the immediate pool area must not be able to be readily opened by children and must either, so it could be, seem to not be readily open, but could still be, must either emit an audible warning or close automatically after use. There should be no or. The door should automatically close. There should be no or. And so the way that we've chosen to instead express it is doors between the building and the immediate pool area must not able to be opened by children. Must not be able to be opened by children, and must close and latch automatically after use. So you've got the double thing of it being inaccessible, and if it is accessed by an adult or someone who's able to access it, it has an automatic swing on it. That, in our minds, was the only acceptable version where you could have a door that opened into immediate pool area or pool. Because that mimics what we ask fences to do. That mimics what we ask other barriers to do. Why would we have a lesser test for an area that opens automatically to a building than we do for fencing around a pool? So that was bottom line for us. Now, my understanding is that the government will not be supporting that amendment, so we will not be supporting this bill. Bottom line for us. Now we had hoped that by putting this up, that might act as some leverage to ask the government to see sense on this, because I do not want to see us down the track reading in the newspaper about a home that thought they were compliant with the law and that surely will have assumed that the law was to protect them and their children, and they had an audible alarm that maybe wasn't quite audible enough, that maybe the battery had powered down on, that maybe there was a power cut and it didn't kick back in, that maybe the family was distracted, thought the alarm from a car had gone off instead of their door. Who knows? I do not want to see a drowning occur in this country that occurs within the boundaries of the law. Because one of the miraculous things with the Fencing of Swimming Pools Act as it stands is that the drownings that have occurred in uncompliant pools, where if they had been compliant with the law, potentially a child may not have drowned. And that would be a devastating thing for families to know. And it would be the stories that came before Select Committee. I would never want any member of this House to hear a story of a child that had drowned that we bore any responsibility for, because it was hard enough hearing it from a member of a family who so clearly carried with them that grief. It was absolutely devastating. So it is incumbent on us to give people the trust that if they comply, that they do what this House has suggested, that it will be enough. And I don't think this bill currently is enough. We really debated, things like if you have a cliff face, does that constitute a barrier? And at the end of the day, the test is that it has to be inaccessible. And I certainly see why Matiria has crafted the bill that she had. Well, actually, it looks like we're not going to be supporting this bill anyway, because for very similar rationale, because it is a real line call to have anything other than a fence form a barrier, and it was one we debated, and we, as I say, Mr. Speaker, really drew a line in the sand on this. One of the issues that I heard a member of the House raise was this idea that we have to always be vigilant around water. Absolutely the case, but that is where we have error, because anyone who's a mother, a father, a grandfather, a grandparent, an aunt knows that 24-hour supervision of a child is exhausting, difficult, and nigh on impossible. So this bill has to be about removing human error. and removing the idea that you can be eyes and ears all of the time. It's about an extra layer of protection. And my concern is that we've left too many openings as it stands that need to be closed, and that's what we're asking for.
Members, we move to the vote on